Zarni, Democratic Caucus Chair of the State Commissioners Association, and Irene F. Sabun, who is the Chief Democracy Officer for the City of New York Mayor. So, who's going to start? Somebody's got to start.
Sure.
Thank you to the chairman of the New York State Assembly Standing Committee on Election Law and Subcommittee on Election Day Operations. And my name's Dustin Zarni. I'm the chair of the Democratic Caucus of the New York State Elections Commissioner Association, as well as an elections commissioner from Onondaga County. And I'm here representing not just the Democratic commissioners from all 62 counties, but the voters of my county who yearn for election reform. Today we'll talk a lot about how we can improve New York's Byzantine election system, but it's important, however, to acknowledge that there are many things that New York does right. Our system of bipartisan election boards is at the top of our successes. The Democratic and Republican commissioners work together to ensure the integrity of our election system. The built-in checks and balances helps New York avoid the partisan battles we see unfolding in other states. Commissioners must find ways to put partisan ideologies aside to meet the needs of the voters. This is also true at the State Board of Elections and the New York City Board of Elections as well. And also thanks to the state legislature and Governor Andrew Cuomo, we have invested in our cybersecurity, and that, along with our paper ballot systems, have allowed us to protect our election results against foreign and domestic attacks. Unfortunately, our New York system of elections has a long way to go to meet the needs of our voting population. In our modern-day society, there is more pressure than ever on our time. We have single-parent households, dual-income households, trying to balance the needs of long work hours, child care, and school activities. Commuters face delays that are out of their control. Family and medical emergencies can further put demands on our already limited time. And with an aging population, elder care and transportation for special needs can further burden our time. We are also a mobile society with frequent residential changes and multiple domiciles. We need an election system that can also adapt to the needs of our citizens. Now, it's been a long hearing already, and I've already submitted my statement here on many of our election reforms, but I'm going to sum those up as well, so we can focus on those election reforms that I believe now have a better chance than ever of passing in the New York State Legislature. Of course, chief and foremost that our citizens want is early voting. The concept of voting only in a single 15-hour period on a Tuesday in November is antiquated and does not take into account our modern needs. Early voting is one of the most vocal demands of citizens coming to our boards of elections, and they see other states, 37 other states, have this convenience, and they don't understand why New York does not. Unfortunately, early voting has become needlessly partisan in New York. We see across the country that every demographic, every ideology enjoys the benefit of early voting. Large, small, red, blue, purple states like Texas, Ohio, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, California, Virginia, and Oklahoma have all adopted early voting and seen its popularity increase. And many will offer no-excuse absentee voting as an alternative to early voting. And this mail-in balloting option reform should be passed, but in addition to early voting, not instead. Many citizens prefer the option of the polling place experience. Citizens, however, should be allowed to vote by mail at will, and removing the excuse portion of the absentee process could lead to participation increases. However, we must also reform the way we canvass those mail-in ballots. Currently, we can only canvass those after Election Day. In the states that have adopted no-excuse absentee or mail-in voting, like California, Oregon, and Washington and Colorado, they canvass those absentees as they come in before Election Day. A bipartisan team of election officials can easily determine whether a ballot is valid or not and allow those to be canvassed and then reported with the election night results. In those other states, they see up to 50% of their mail their ballots be mail-in voting. If we are not canvassing and reporting those on election night, then we will add uncertainty into the election system, as we won't know who the winners are on election night. And as we can see from the last panel, that became a very big issue in New York City this last time on several races not being reported. and imagine that statewide. But we can't do early voting and no excuse absentee voting alone. We need to reform the way we register voters. We must remove the initial barrier to participation by switching to automatic voter registration. Automatic voter registration is one of the fastest growing electoral reforms in America. 15 states have already enacted it, and as Mr. Carroll stated earlier, this would be an opportunity for New York to be on the vanguard of reform as opposed to following the rest of the country. If we remove that, if we switch to an opt-out instead of an opt-in system at the DMVs, but also at the social services in New York, then not only will we swell our voter rolls, but we will have more accurate voter rolls as people update their addresses more frequently with these agencies than they will with the boards of registrations themselves. AVR will eliminate most of the registration issues that voters face, but same-day registration should also be passed to help meet the needs of late moves and those who fall through the cracks of an AVR system. They can be treated as affidavit ballots at polling places and allow bipartisan review of the registration in a post-election setting. Ballots could be canvassed with absentees that arrive after Election Day. We should also remove the burdensome regulation that disallows votes from voters who vote by affidavit at a wrong polling place. Often a voter will be casting ballots on a similar ballot, but just down the street from where they should be. Boards of elections could easily determine if they voted in races they were ineligible to do so and disallow the votes in those races only, not the entire ballot, as is current law. Almost all of the reforms I've mentioned can be implemented with minimal costs, as it's only changing procedures we already do. We already register voters, so automatic voter registration will shift the registration from the deadlines to a constant flow throughout the year. We already do affidavit ballots, so same-day registration and removing the polling place limitation will only change how we count the voters. We already process absentee ballots, so changing to no excuse would only change when we canvass them and how they are applied for. Of course, the most expensive and radical change to our election system is also the change that the voters want the most, early voting. In the last session, lawmakers saw the need to make sure that the cost of early voting was not an unfunded mandate to the counties that host the boards of elections. It's important that New York State either passes a permanent line in the budget that reimburses counties for costs associated with early voting or using the unclaimed funds, as was in several of the bills last session. In addition, the legislature should recognize the need to pass this reform early in the session if the intent is to implement by the general election of 2019. County and city boards will need to recruit polling stations and inspectors. Logistically, we face a bit of a conundrum that the moving of the primary to an earlier date is a necessity for early voting to work, but if the primary is moved to June in 2019, we may not have time to also implement early voting for that primary. We should target the general election of 2019 for implementation and then institute primary early voting in 2020. Finally, we must stop seeing election reform as a partisan measure. It is troubling that many of these reforms have passed the Assembly and not even gotten the courtesy of a vote in the Senate. With a new makeup in the Senate, it is hoped that this will change. There are also reforms that have bipartisan agreements, such as the permissive use of electronic poll books and a unified federal and local primary. The latter option could save New York taxpayers an estimated $50 million every 2 years and reduce voter fatigue. Every election, my office and the boards of elections throughout New York State are contacted by voters angry that the New York State voting system is so behind the country on many reforms, and they see voting other systems of our country enjoy. The citizens of New York deserve the convenience of election reforms we can provide. It is my hope that New York State government will, in early 2019, pass these reforms so we can work on perfecting them in the 2019 election cycle. We don't want to try to implement these reforms in the heat of a presidential election in 2020. I'm confident the Commissioner, the county boards of elections, as well as New York City and state boards can handle all of these reforms, and I hope the legislature will give us the tools to implement them and serve the needs of our voters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
Good afternoon, Chair Levine, Chair Buchwald, and members of the Election Law Committee. My name is Irene Fonseca Sabuni. I am the Chief Democracy Officer for the City of New York. I'd like to start by thanking you for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to testify before you on an important topic that impacts 4.6 million voters in New York City. I want to start by telling you about my job and the Democracy NYC initiative that was initiated by the mayor. The seed for the Democracy NYC initiative was planted in 2016 after the illegal purge of 200,000 voters from the rolls in Brooklyn, New York. Combined with the low voter turnout during the 2016 general election, the administration identified a need to increase civic participation and outreach to ensure that these mistakes did not happen again. The Democracy NYC initiative is tasked with increasing voter registration, participation, and civic engagement throughout New York City. The mayor announced it in his State of the City address earlier this year, including a 10-point plan to make New York City the fairest, most civically engaged city in the nation. Earlier this year, Philip Thompson was appointed the Deputy Mayor for Strategic Policy Initiatives and tasked with overseeing the Democracy NYC initiative, and I was appointed just last month. In the 5 weeks I have been in this role, I have met with New Yorkers in every borough of all walks of life, young and old, in high schools, in senior centers, in community centers all over the city. And what I have heard from them is the same thing. It is too hard to vote in New York. I've relished the opportunity to talk with them and to tell them that the time is now for change. The time is now for early voting. The time is now for no-fault absentee voting, and that this cycle, these changes must be made. The high voter turnout was anticipated for months, potentially for years in this election. We also heard that the possibility of a 2-page ballot has been on the table for a number of years. And yet, last Tuesday, we saw lines of 2 and 3 hours. Several of the members have spoken to their own experience. People waiting in the rain, people leaving their polling places without voting, truly being disenfranchised because of the long lines, places without operable scanners or with only a fraction of operable scanners, people filling out their ballots without adequate privacy. I want to tell you a little bit about the work we have done at the city level to implement change. Voting rights are civil rights. It's absolutely critical that we make voting accessible to all who are eligible, including and particularly those communities that have historically had low participation or been disenfranchised. To that end, the city has spearheaded a number of initiatives around engaging young voters, voters with limited English proficiency, and those who have been or are engaged with our justice system. The city has also offered the Board of Elections $20 million to support and reform the institution which is responsible for administering elections in this city. To tell you a little bit about those initiatives, in May, for the first time, the Democracy NYC initiatives, partnering with the Campaign Finance Board, elected officials, and community-based organizations around the city, implemented the first student voter registration day in all New York City public high schools. On one day, we registered over 10,000 young people who were eligible to vote. Likewise, in order to support voters with limited English proficiency in last Tuesday's election, the mayor's office provided interpretation services at approximately 100 additional poll sites in Russian, Haitian Creole, Italian, Arabic, Polish, and Yiddish. These are in addition to the languages required by the Voting Rights Act. Working with the Campaign Finance Board and the Legal Aid Society, the city also implemented an initiative to register nearly 900 incarcerated individuals and visitors at Rikers Island. However, these initiatives are not enough. We need systemic reform at the state level to bring New York into the 21st century in terms of our elections. This election here in New York City, we had 900,000 more people participate than in the last midterm in 2014. That's enormous. It shows the interest, excitement of New Yorkers to participate. At the same time, we see that New York State had among the lowest participation rates of all the states. The fourth lowest participation, 46 states had higher participation than New York. So we see the interest, and we also see that we need to make it easier and that we can do better in terms of making it easy to vote in this state. So I want to thank the members of the Assembly who have passed our election reform package of bills last session and in prior years, and ask for your continued leadership and support in continuing this important work. In terms of the specific reforms we see as critical this year, BOE reform, New York City deserves a professionalized and modernized Board of Elections, which would ensure that what happened last week will never happen again. The BOE needs a chief executive, including an executive director and a deputy director, empowered to make decisions on day-to-day operations, and that could engage in voter outreach, hire independent experts, and better train workers. We need early voting. As has been said, 37 states and the District of Columbia currently have some form of early voting to allow voters to have some choice over when and how they cast their ballots. The experience of voters in other states shows that early voting is utilized. Last week, 36 million people voted, prior to last week, in the election that took place last week, 36 million people voted early. In the 2016 election, 1/3 of voters voted early. In fact, in several states, in this midterm election, early voter turnout surpassed total turnout in 2014. We see that young people and women disproportionately participate in early voting. These are communities that we need to engage. I've heard the call for early voting from working parents, elderly people, people with disabilities, and students. The time is now for this reform to take place in New York State. We also need no excuse absentee voting so that you don't need a pre-approved reason. You can vote by absentee by choice. As my colleague just said, we need modernized and reformed voter registration, including automatic voter registration, not only at the DMV, but also at social service agencies. We need pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds that is currently available in 14 states. If we want young people to participate, we have to make it easier for them to participate. We also need same-day registration so that people who have moved or people who may not have had the time to register in advance can participate on Election Day. Finally, we need electronic poll books. 34 states currently use this technology in order to make the Election Day process more nimble, more efficient, and more accurate. Voting in New York has been too hard for too long. It is time to make it easier to vote here. The reforms described above are much needed and past due. It's time for New York to join dozens of other states in implementing common sense reforms that protect the right to vote. With your leadership, we can and we must have these reforms in place well in advance of the 2020 election. I appreciate the Assembly's focus on this issue, which is critically important to the health of our democracy, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you both. Question?
Yeah.
Ms. Walker?
Yep.
I have one, but my question for both of you is simply, can you respond to the statement we heard earlier today that early voting in other states doesn't increase turnout? Just what's your response?
I think the question of turnout is a difficult question to answer because as early voting has been implemented in these states, so has voter registration reforms that makes it easier for people to vote. So as we make sure more people are registered to vote, the turnout models that aren't comparable. You're comparing apples to oranges. But what we do see is usage in these states of early voting dramatically increasing each and every year. We know that the citizens who have it like it and are starting to use it more. And that, and also these other states that have early voting, they're ahead of us in voter turnout. If you're comparing New York State voter turnout to their voter turnout, they're way ahead of us. We're one of the worst in the state. Early voting, as other people have said, it's not a panacea, but if it's combined with other reforms, it can help our voter turnout problem in New York. So while there's been these statements that there's no evidence of turnout increases, there is evidence of usage increases and voter satisfaction who have early voting.
And I think that
Yeah, exactly. We know that 36 million people used early voting. We know that in 12 of the 13 highest voting states had some form of early voting, so people are using this. It is part of a package of changes that increases participation. Here in New York, we are behind in so many ways that we can put together a package of things that will increase turnout and participation. I would say that while it may not we may not be able to scientifically isolate this issue, but what we can know is that it will address the debacle that happened last week in New York City. So people voting early will address many of those issues as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you so much for your testimony. I have to admit, even from our conversations, that I think it's a great idea for the mayor to institute this position, though it was fraught with many complaints about how undemocratic the process was in terms of identifying the democracies are. We appreciate the fact that he'd actually appointed you to this role. And I do appreciate your testimony. It's very progressive, particularly with respect to early voting and a number of the other issues that we're championing here. To the extent that we don't have early voting, we were fraught with many issues on Election Day, on the past election. So I'm wondering, were you able to have a conversation perhaps with anyone at the New York City Board of Elections so that you were informed that perhaps the ballot was 2 pages long and that there may have been some issues that may come up with respect to the process on Election Day?
Prior to Election Day?
Yes.
My office was in touch with the Board of Election leading up to Election Day, particularly around planning for the interpreters. In terms of that particular issue, I had not heard that raised prior to Election Day.
Were you made aware that because if they mentioned, someone who was on staff, who's at a pretty high level, did mention that there were 2 pages. Were you aware that they'd be 2 pages long?
Yes, yeah, it was known. It had been known for some time that there would be 2 pages, and I think I heard testimony earlier from the board that it was something that had been contemplated before, because there was this potential for ballot questions.
So do you think that perhaps there were any processes that could have been put in play to let people know that they should split their ballot in half instead of trying to jam the 2 sheets connected through? You guys really did have a strong campaign around flip the ballot. I think it should have been flip and tear, because folk really just didn't know how to handle it on Election Day. So I just, so it was just sort of, so I just was wondering what the relationship is like for someone with the administration related to voting, and how your interaction has been sort of with the New York City Board of Elections as it relates to the administration of what you're responsible for.
Sure. So a big part of our focus is voter education and outreach. I myself am not part of the Charter Revision Commission. That was a separate entity that was doing that. But I absolutely think we do need to be doing that outreach and that education well in advance. And with respect to your question, we do have we have folks on staff who were in touch with them leading up with the BOE leading up to the election, and I think the question now is how do we work together moving forward to make elections better in this city?
Okay, well, I don't think it's a question. I think it's really something that is imperative that we're able to work out. So, secondly, I heard you mention about registering folk out on Rikers Island. and also in high schools. So when you were registering in high schools, were these the 17-year-olds that you were registering?
17, 18, 19. I mean, I used
17,
to teach
18,
in high
19, but
school.
as young as 17.
Yeah, as young as 17, exactly. If they're turning 18 within the calendar year, they're eligible. And I do think making it legal for 16-year-olds to register as is possible in other states would be a good move. And to your prior question regarding the Board of Elections, the mayor made an offer 2 years ago of $20 million to the Board of Elections to implement much-needed reforms, including implementing a blue ribbon commission to identify the failures after the voter purge, including implementing an outside consultant who could identify and address these issues, day of logistics, poll worker training, voter education and outreach. So that offer was made 2 years ago. It is still on the table. It's disappointing that it wasn't taken up because perhaps if it had been 2 years ago, we wouldn't have seen those problems that we saw last week.
Oh, well, I think that's definitely something that could be left for further conversation. Lastly, one of the issues that came up, I guess, really early on in your tenure was that there were these cards that were sent out, I believe, from your office to, I don't know, someone threw out a number of over 400,000 people telling them that their registration was inactive, but in fact they were active. So can you tell me what happened there?
I'd be happy to speak to that.
And what was done to rectify the situation?
Yes. So just to give the background and context, that mailer originated, the idea for that also originated in 2016 when 200,000 voters were illegally purged in Brooklyn. There was an interest and a need to reach out to folks to let them know their status. As has been testified about earlier, inactive status, if you get one bounce back, the Board of Election reaches out to you, they get a bounce back at your mailing address, and you will then be moved to inactive status. So the purpose of the mailer was to let people know that they had been, that they were in inactive status. We also did robocalls, we did text messages. The purpose of the Democracy NYC initiative is to let people know, educate them, empower them to take action. We mailed the letter to around 400,000 people. The vast majority of those people were inactive and got that letter in time to change their status. Now, it's true that some people did get the letter in error. We followed up with around 50,000 people. We sent them a postcard letting them know that they did get it in error and steps they could take to check their registration status and confirm and vote in time for Election Day. So I think the effort there, we see our other states around the country removing people from the polls, and we wanted to make sure that people knew their status and knew it in time to take action to change it from inactive to active if they wish to do so.
So I just wanted to point out that I can't tell you that I've met anyone who actually received the letter who was actually inactive. But could you imagine what we had to go through in terms of getting people registered and ensuring a consistent election cohort of constituents, and then to receive this letter in error from your office, and how that in and of itself had the effect of being disenfranchising, if that's of an appropriate terminology?
I understand that for the people who received it in error.
Because they came in and they were saying, look at this letter. Mm-hmm. I got this from the Board of Election. It wasn't clear who actually sent the letter because it wasn't signed by anyone, right? And so to the extent that it wasn't signed by yourself or any member of your staff, people thought it was fraud. People they blamed everybody under the sun, and I'm sure you know who the number one person that they blamed was.
Yes.
And I think that in my opinion, it was egregious and unacceptable, and I don't want to, deliberate it any further, but I do think that there's something that your office should undertake, in terms of really speaking to New York City residents to let them know this was done in error, and we want to help restore your faith in the system, because particularly in districts like mine, where voting rights sort of many tricks are played, it really took away a lot of the respect and the faith that they had in the system. So I'd like to discuss this with you further.
Sure, absolutely. And I will just say that that's why we did follow up with those 50,000. I think that it was a learning process, absolutely. And we are doing it better. We learned a lot about, one, how to scrub the data with a data field of that size. There are some challenges with it, so we learned about that. We also learned about the language we should use in communicating with people, and have been working closely with the Campaign Finance Board and good government groups to make sure that in the communication we do moving forward, there won't be those kinds of issues. But absolutely, we did follow up with those people, and I'd be happy to speak with you further. And we tried to get the word out as much as possible following that, that people should know the effort and the hundreds of thousands of people who received the card or who received the letter, who were supposed to receive it, were accurately informed and empowered to make the choice to change their status. And we're sorry for those who received it in error, and we are making sure that our processes internally address those kinds of issues moving forward.
Thank you.
If I could, I'd like to just point out that when we're talking about voting reforms,
My mom would have a piece of advice for you right here at this point. If you're not in the hot seat, don't put yourself in it.
I understand. But what I'd like to point out is that early voting and moving the primary could help rectify some of these problems that we're seeing in not just in New York City, in other boards as well, because it moves the calendar earlier, identifies the problems earlier, and we're not dealing with those problems on election day. And if we concentrate on moving the primary and getting early voting in, going forward, I think we can have some of these problems that are happening, not just in New York City, in other boards as well, on a smaller scale, that we will be able to identify people that may have been inactivated or may have been purged on accident or may have actually been purged on purpose, and allowing them to have proper time to go get court orders so they can vote on election day.
But I don't think that the situation was the fact that these folk were purged. The issue was they were not purged.
Right.
However, they received an indication from the mayor's office that they were, and it sort of sent a sort of reckoning
I understand,
throughout.
and those kind of errors are regrettable.
But your point is well taken.
Thank
And
you.
the other thing I would say is if we had same-day registration, that would also address issues like this.
Yes.
And Dustin, just so you know, before I call on Mr. Carroll, and then other people have to have some questions as well. So Latrice, my mom used to say, if you don't have anything nice to say about anybody, don't say anything at all. And then she would say the worst things about people.
That's a little like what I did, I think. So I learned well from your mom.
Mr. Carroll.
Well, I only have nice things to say. First, thank you both for your testimony. And I was glad to hear and heartened to hear that both of you support, a whole gambit of voting reforms. But neither of you mentioned one of the most important reforms, and one of those reforms that causes some of the most confusion and caused lots of the major confusion in the Democratic presidential primary in April 2016, and continually cause confusion in primaries every single year. And that is the fact that the state of New York has far and away the most onerous party enrollment change in the nation. The next closest party enrollment change is in Tennessee, I believe, and it's about 120 days. New York's is over 330 days. There is a simple constitutional fix, and that is to bring it down to the constitutional minimum of 10 days. Both of you have said you are for same-day registration. Are both of you for bringing party enrollment changes down to the 10-day constitutional minimum? And if you're not, why?
as a representative of my caucus has taken no position, so I will give you my personal position on this. I am for bringing it down, but I am for bringing it down to 90 days, not 10 days, and I'll explain why. I do believe that party primaries and indication of a party enrollment is an intentional act, and that the nominees of the parties should be reflective of the people that are registered in the party. I also note that boards of elections have to prepare these poll books to be ready for election day. If you have party changes as late as 10 days, you're basically adding people to the poll books sometimes after they're printed. In smaller counties upstate, they're going to vendors outside for printing. They're not printing in-house. And those printings start happening around 20, 25 days. That's why the voter registration deadline is in there. So it's also a matter of practicality. Now, if we had electronic poll books, that could be a solution, that we enter into electronic poll books and then address the number of days after we work out the kinks with electronic poll books. But I do agree with you that the party change sequester, that I like to call it a sequester, that they wait almost 13 months from, and they have to change their registration 30 days before a general election for all of the next calendar year, is onerous. It's hard for the lay citizen to understand why that's there. I understand the history of that.
It causes suppression.
And it causes suppression.
Don't come back.
And I, as a person who is a partisan, who is involved in a party, I want people to be able to switch into my party. So I would like that, but I would like it at the 90-day mark so we can know who the electorate is, and the campaigns can know who the electorate is and who they're campaigning to, so they can have a way to communicate with those voters.
And I would say last session we did support the bill that was in the Senate to change it to the 90-day time frame prior to elections, and that is something that we would support moving forward. I think both for practical and election reasons, so people know who they're
So
campaigning
for the record, though, I just want to have both of you be very, very clear. For the record, you both support keeping the primary closed by such an extent that folks must register in that party well before anyone knows who the candidates are for that office. Because that's exactly what you're both saying, because one does not know who the candidates for any party office are until the end of the petitioning period, which is no more than 60 days before, of course, that party primary. And that is the law. So I'm just saying, making sure you both understand that.
While the public may not know for certain who a candidate is by the end of the petition period, certainly campaigning happens before that. So
not much before that. I think there's a new state senator who got into a highly contested state senate race just this year about 3 or 4 days before the deadline, and he ended up winning that primary, sir.
I would say that would be the exception rather than the rule, sir, but I do understand your point. However, from a practical matter, I do believe in shortening it. I think we just disagree on how many days we should shorten it to.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
By the way, there are several bills, and hopefully they will become laws, that will allow people under the age of 18 to register to vote in an election at which time they are 18. So that will be a good thing for younger people.
You mean for the pre-registration?
Yes.
Because it's already the law for 17-year-olds.
Yes. So, Mr. Taylor.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for being here today. I just have one question for you, ma'am. With respect to the mailing that was used, where did you get that list? And if it wasn't the Board of Elections, why wouldn't you take it from the Board of Elections?
Sure. We used an outside vendor, and the purpose of that was to get updated addresses. The Board of Elections does not. The reason somebody would be marked as inactive with the Board of Elections is because they got the bounce back, right?
Right.
So then the Board of Elections, if we use their list, we would be reaching out to people at that same address, which for many people is out of date. Mm-hmm. So we use an outside vendor. The name of the vendor is Civis Analytics, in order to get updated addresses.
Right.
And they had updated it through some commercial ways, or if you do a change of address with the USPS, ways like that, so that the purpose was to get an updated address and reach people at their new address.
I appreciate that. Help me unpack this, and I apologize if you've already done this because I was out of the room. When you say inactive, what qualifies for inactive based on your understanding?
Sure, we
the
talked
board
about-
does what and when? And
I'd
what
be
period?
happy to. In order to be marked as inactive, only one thing has to happen, and that is the Board of Elections reaches out, sends a letter to you, and they get it bounced back to them.
And that makes you inactive.
That
Although
makes you inactive.
inactive.
Yes.
Now, what if, so just for hypothetical purposes, let's say I voted in the general election, and now we're approaching primary season, which would be September, and they would do a mailing to see whether or not I was still there, da-da-da. Right. Now, if I don't respond prior to that primary, you're saying that I would fall into an inactive.
That's their procedure,
Okay.
yes.
But if I show up to vote that day, I am, because my name and everything should be in the book already, so I would vote, correct?
If you're inactive, your name will not be in the book. You would vote by affidavit ballot.
And if you vote by affidavit ballot, that does reactivate
No,
you.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I got to get some catching up here because I remember at one point, if you voted, because I didn't think the board could move that swiftly about anything. So you're saying, but and there's no disrespect. So if what's happening is the board is saying, aha, they voted in November, they were there in the primary, and now by the time we roll around to September, they've placed me in inactive if I haven't responded to a card.
Not responded.
Not responded,
It's whether the card bounces back. All you have to do is receive the card. If it gets to you, that you don't get inactive.
correct.
No, I just don't want to sound so cynical, but sometimes stuff is happening at the board. By the time that card comes back, they don't even know that the card has come back. So I'm just thinking how all this magic happens in such a short span of time.
Sure, I can't speak to the exact delays that you may be referencing.
You know what I'm saying?
But certainly people can be marked inactive between the general of one year and the primary of the following year.
So if we're saying, take me there, the card has to happen before the September primary in order to be inactive, correct?
Yes.
So somewhere in there, let's say they do it December, January. So the election is certified sometime right after Thanksgiving, December. Okay, somewhere in there, if there's no hotly contested race, so it's certified. Now you move forward, and I've worked at the board. I know it gets a little crazy over there. So at the end of the day, what we're thinking about happening, there's going to be a mailing that will take place, March or April?
I can't
Somewhere
say
around
exactly
there?
when the mailing
Okay.
take place,
I'm
but
just trying to
within that
visualize
time
it.
period, certainly that transition can occur, that folks who were active are then
Shifted.
Yeah,
Okay.
that
And
can
I think it's
happen.
important that they don't
I-
fall into the inactive. Are you going to get in trouble?
I'm going to get in trouble.
Okay.
The mailing takes place in July. This
July.
mail check cards go out in July. Now, where I won't get in trouble is because I cannot speak to what happens at the New York City Board of Elections. They were just here, and they would be better off answering this question. However, I will note that in many of the Board of Elections throughout the state, the inactive status doesn't happen until after the next election because they don't have the staff to get it done beforehand. Also, that's not the only way someone can get inactive. We could get an obituary. We could get a death roll. That might put somebody inactive, and if they, if it's a mistake and they vote, they can reactivate themselves. We could get a notice from another county that they had moved and registered in another county. That's another way to put them inactive in our county. There's many ways that somebody can get inactive, not just the mail check card, although that is the most common way.
Okay, and thank you. And for the record, I'm not here to defend the board. I'm just trying to get clarity. Thank you.
Michael?
This afternoon. So the voter guide that went out in which it conveyed wrongly stating that felons on parole didn't have the right to vote. Who was that, through your team or through the campaign finance board?
Campaign Finance Board.
And so there was no connection between the two departments before something like that would go out?
That's something that they do independent as part of their mandate. As soon as we saw that and heard that, we notified them right away and asked them to publicize the actual information, which is that as a parolee, if you get the conditional pardon, your voter rights can be reinstated. So, but we were not involved with that mailer.
And person on parole, just for language.
Person on
We don't
parole.
say parolee.
Sure.
Okay. And so, is there any coordination between Campaign Finance Board and your team since then?
We work I can say that from our end, we do, with all our outreach, we coordinate with them and speak to them about it. From their end, that I did speak to them after that because I was very concerned about that information, the misinformation that had been included. But at that time, they said that they had sent that to the printer months ago, and they had not shared that with our team prior to that.
So just for further guidance, then, the CFB engage with other entities when it comes to election information? I mean, it's quite concerning that they would have sent out something without coordinating with your department at all.
I can't speak to what they do. I know that they've been sending that out for years, and our office is a new office.
And so the information that is then shared out. So when it comes to civic engagement moving forward and awareness moving forward, who will be sending out information? Will your office be sending out something separate from CFB?
We will be coordinating with them to make sure that folks are civically engaged and voter education and outreach is happening, and we'll be determining whether they're going to do outreach and what we're going to do separate from them and in collaboration with them.
So I guess for clarity,
Yeah.
it is possible that the two of you could be sending out information that could be different on the same matters then.
We have, since I started, when we do outreach, we coordinate with them in advance.
I understand. And gets me a little frustrating right now. So I'm literally asking, it is possible that you all could send out information about the same thing around voting and not coordinate on that.
I can say from our office, from my side, I can't speak to what they do in their office, but from our office, all the outreach that we've done, we have coordinated with them and other good government groups in order to make sure that our information and outreach is coordinated. I can't speak to what another organization does.
Why couldn't, thinking of this through, why couldn't City Hall determine that only one of you would send out information? I mean, there's two city entities that it is very possible could both be sending out information about the exact same thing. So why wouldn't you just coordinate with the mayor and those down at City Hall and saying only one of us are going to send out this information?
So the CFB is an
I understand.
independent, yeah.
Absolutely, but I'm just basing on what you said. You said you all are coordinating moving forward.
Yes.
So if there's coordination on information moving forward, then why wouldn't there be coordination to say one of us will send out this and the other won't send out the other?
That moving forward, we will be able to coordinate and be in touch and make sure that we're working in collaboration and that we're, speaking about things consistently and able to coordinate in that way. I think. Are you asking for a specific mailer that would happen, or?
I mean, I guess there could be a whole host of them. I mean, the question earlier about inactive status. I mean, I think there's confusion on just how someone even gets that designation. So, in that instance, who would send out information to New Yorkers conveying someone being active right now?
No one else has been. The CFB has not reached out to, as far as I'm aware, reached out to voters regarding their voter status. So that was something our office did.
Okay. So, current and moving forward, the clarification of someone to understand how they can become an active or inactive voter will come from your office.
There's also, moving forward, this is something we're going to be working together and coordinating. I think that we are very committed to voter education and outreach and to letting people know their status in advance so that they can take action to change their status if they wish to do so. I think that this past experience was a learning experience, and we are committed to making sure that New Yorkers are informed of their status in a timely fashion so that they can change it if they wish to. So I think with respect to the specifics, we want to make sure it's done by the group best situated to do that. and I think we will be coordinating moving forward. As I sit here, I can't say exactly who will be doing it because we just finished with the election last week, so we're figuring out right now as we speak the best way to coordinate moving forward.
Okay, so for finality, so one of the reasons, if I understood you correctly, one of the reasons someone could become inactive is if there was the bounce back that occurred.
Yes.
So if I have my own mailing address and I also have a P.O. box and something doesn't come to me, as of now, I still could end up being inactive and going to elections next year.
That's correct, but that's the Board of Elections handles that status, yeah.
I guess, but this is what I keep going back to. You have one entity handling status, but either they or you are sending out information to people about how to be involved in elections. And that doesn't seem to...
Yeah, what I would say is 2 years ago, the mayor offered $20 million to the Board of Elections and asked them to do more voter outreach, and that was declined. And we know that the voter purge happened in Brooklyn 2 years ago, and 200,000 people were purged improperly and illegally. So we have taken on that outreach because no one else is doing it, yes.
So how are you contacting those individuals that if something was mailed to them and it bounced back, then one would presume that the mailing address was wrong?
The inactive, that's what you're asking about. So that was to Assemblymember Taylor's question. The reason that we used an outside vendor was in order to have updated addresses, and so that's how we reached out through mail. We also did robocalls and texts.
And so to the latter, how effective were the robocalls and texts? I guess if the mailing addresses didn't work, then reaching out through that mechanism wouldn't be effective for follow-up outreach.
The mailing mechanism worked for hundreds of thousands of people. I think we've learned that there's additional data scrubbing and work that needed to happen. So that is work that will happen, in the future moving forward to make sure we're reaching the right people.
Thank you. Mr. Buckwell.
Yeah, just a statement to correct something I inadvertently misstated earlier in response to points raised by Mr. Taylor. A voter becomes an inactive voter when they are sent what's called a confirmation notice. And if someone receives a confirmation notice, which is a statement from your Board of Elections of, we think you've moved, have you moved, you should respond immediately. But we were conflating this, and I was conflating this, with the annual usually postcards, I think in most jurisdictions, that simply are an effort by the Board of Elections to, first of all, inform every voter of when primary day and general election day and where their polling place is and so forth. When those bounce back, and you don't have to respond to, obviously, if you receive, it's just informing you, but when those bounce back, that provides the basis for a Board of Elections to say, we think you might have moved, so therefore we will send you a confirmation notice. Upon being sent the confirmation notice, the voter can be turned into an inactive voter, and that's when someone needs to respond. So I just wanted to clarify that for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Ms. Walker.
Well, I think then that perhaps take into consideration your clarification that the letter perhaps could have said, we understand that you may have updated your address or moved or whatever. We think it's important for you to check your voter registration status because according to A, B, and C, you may be moved to inactive status, as opposed to your voter registration is inactive. You better get down here within, a week and a half. Otherwise, you won't be able to vote on election day. I think that level of hysteria, I think, is really what was what was the most problematic at that moment. While I do agree that this process, like we did have a hearing in the past on this particular issue with respect to the voter purging and the removal to the inactive status, but I don't want to in any way confuse that with what actually transpired. And so perhaps, again, in terms of some things that we could learn today, moving forward, I think that this is a great one. Or perhaps, let's have a conversation about what that looks like, and perhaps maybe work with some of the elected officials in that area who, we have a vested interest in making sure that we have an informed electorate. Election law and voting rights is something that, I stand behind 110,000% even before I got elected. So at least hi, my name is so-and-so. I'm a new person who works in this particular capacity. I would love the opportunity to meet with you because these are some of the concerns that we have. And then we could have had an entire dialogue as to how we could have moved forward to prevent what actually happened in many areas from happening again. So again, thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely, and I think we do intend to work with the elected officials and good government groups, and that in all outreach since that, we have been sharing it with good government groups, with the Campaign Finance Board, in order to make sure that the communication, that the language is as clear as it can be.
By the way, before you go, just a point of clarification, our colleague Joanne Simon, who was here earlier, does have a bill that will allow for a change in party registration, probably not as generous as Mr. Carroll would like to see.
I have a bill that is 10 days, so
But
I think that's the better bill.
Hers is 90 days before the date of a primary election. So this is something that'll get some good scrutiny now. Thank you both.
Thank you.
So our next group of panelists are Susan Lerner, Ethan Garinger-Samath, Jennifer Wilson, and Kate Doran. And if I'm pronouncing anyone's name wrong, please tell me.